So I was asked that I come and present something that I just presented at the CASFEP conference. So I think some of you may have heard this. So if you did, I will try to keep it as interesting. But if you weren't, hopefully this gives you something to think about. And small group, so let's have. I want to hope to have more of a discussion about what we see happening in our state, in particular, what's happening with funding, both as we look at state funding and potential changes, as we look ahead with uncertainty around sequestration at our federal funding level, and what that all means for if we plan, and not actually if, but how we might plan moving forward. So I've titled this, Are We There Yet? Because I think this is one of those things where you're sitting in the back of the car and you keep going and you go, well, aren't we there? And the parent standard answer is we're halfway there, right? Or almost there. And we've been on this journey in California trying to figure out, do we actually have money? And is it ours to spend? And we keep asking that question year after year. And every year we go, well, we're not sure, right? And it's that answer like, are we lost? I'm not sure. And it feels like we're finally arriving at something with some sense, at least if you look at it from an economic standpoint, where California truly is turned the corner and is making some recovery. But we then look around and go, well, are we going to have further federal cuts? Are we going to see clarity on what we get through this new funding formula? And what do I do? So what I want to talk about first is what's happening with our state budget. And that is, I think we've come into this period of cuts, cuts, cuts. And so we've been very acculturated to the budget just isn't good. And I think that part of what we all have to start to realize is things are actually going to get better. And so those behaviors and those coping mechanisms, both I'd say technical as well as emotional that we've established in recent years, we actually have to start undoing. And that is, we've looked and we've tried to make the most and squeeze things out and taken on new jobs and looked around and said, okay, some things just aren't going to happen and we have a good excuse because there's no money. We actually now, that excuse isn't there. We start to see a system where there is assured growth. The passage of Prop 30 provided that for us here in California. So what does it mean to go back to the way we used to think prior to 2008-9? And think about the things that we can do instead of all the things we got to undo or not do. And so I think that's going to be a bit of a challenge because we have just spent a 5-year period wondering if we still have jobs. And see, there's humor. So that's something that we just got. It's not even just you in this room, but it's the way that our teachers, the way that our administrators, the way that our communities perhaps feel about what we do in education right now, is that we have gone to them constantly, asking about, well, what can we do without? I mean, we're, supposedly, recovering, which I think if you look at it economically, but I'm, in Sacramento, and last night the Sacramento School Board just evaluated 10 school closures, and they approved 7 of them. So you go, well, how can that be? Well, that's just delayed reaction, right? They've been declining. We had lots of cuts to make. They lived on reserves. So your districts may still find that even as resources go up, there are some things that you really delayed doing that you need to confront. But you have to separate whether it's because of money or things that you should have done long ago because of money that you're living with now. So there's like all sorts of things to sort out. But I think that you can actually see in the governor's budget the recognition of this turning point. And it's not just the governor's budget, but the Legislative Analyst's Office also shows agreement that this is happening, that we really are seeing growth in state revenue. And it looks to be ongoing, and it looks to be a real positive in terms of the growth that we're going to see in K-12 education. But as I said earlier, we don't know exactly what's going to happen with federal funding. You just listen to the news, and March 1st we're going to have, FAA is going to have furloughs, and so planes won't be flying, and forget about getting your tax refund, but they certainly will still have staff to make sure that you paid your extra taxes. I mean, all this stuff is happening, and so the federal government's reaction is really interesting. if you look at any guidance that's come out of the Federal Department of Education regarding sequestrations, they all have to do with what should staff at the U.S. Department of Education do about themselves. And what do they need to do to take 1 month, 1 day every pay period, or 2 days a month off. But not about what does this mean for our students in our schools for which we have significant federal funding. And so that has not started to really, I think, materialize, in part because they're thinking, well, states have this under control. So at this point, when we look at sequestration, we're looking at about a 5% cut. I think this is a situation where it's not a question of if, it's really just a question of when. And so we will see that, March 1st, maybe it doesn't happen then, but at some point I think we need to be prepared for that. And so we're looking at this all taking effect within our education funding budgets at your school districts in 2013-14. And that's because we are forward funded, so it applies to the feds immediately, but we haven't been actually appropriated that money yet. So when we get appropriated that money as part of our 2013-14 budgets, it would reflect that lower amount. So, and this is something that I think actually, it's going to affect all your title programs, and that's going to, you're going to manage that, you're going to juggle some things around. The big hit is it actually affects IDEA funding, special education. And so when you look at your title programs, you go, okay, well, maybe we just won't spend as much on supplies. Maybe we won't add that extra training. Maybe we won't, go on to do that extra event. But in the case of IDEA funds, your federal special ed dollars, those are all being spent right now. There's not a single district in the state that looks around and goes, gosh, what am I going to do with this extra IDEA money? So that creates then additional pressures on your district budget overall, which puts pressures, I think, on the rest of our categorical. So it's sort of a distributed effect with IDEA, a direct hit on your title programs when you look at what is the overall dynamic in a district budget. The other piece is, right now, we persist with the same accountability requirements. If you've been following the blogosphere in education, you know that Arne Duncan is talking to states in California, and AXA and the core districts are moving forward with looking at district waiver options. As of now, we don't have them, but the thing we have to reconcile is we have a state accountability system. So if we get a waiver, what does that look like for those districts? And does our U.S. Department of Education monitor districts with waivers, or does our State Department, or somehow both, or what is the mechanics? So those are all things that are out there. And then this whole weighted student formula conversation. Our state legislature is going to have their first hearing on weighted student formula in the Education Policy Committee on February 28th. And the way they've structured this hearing is they're going to hear from the Governor's Office of Finance to talk about what this looks like in terms of dollars and cents. They're then going to hear about the Legislative Analyst's Office recommendations from their analysis of this proposal. And then they have a superintendent's panel that's coming in. And the superintendent's panel is going to talk about what they like, what they don't, what they think about the proposal. And then finally, they're ending with a research panel. And they have some staff folks from the Public Policy Institute of California talking about their latest brief and analysis that came out, I think, this week or last week. And then I'm going to be talking about what do we know from research in other states. So here's what we know. See, I'm going to tell you before I tell the Senate. And that is, there are no other states that have tried to do what our local control funding formula is proposing. Not because there aren't other states that have weighted student formulas. There's a lot of states. In fact, there's a lot of states and a lot of large districts that have weighted student formulas. And they've used them to provide for local flexibility, to build in some sense of equity or fairness in the way that the money is given out. But there are not states that have tied or tried to tie as closely as we want to in our state accountability and flexibility. And so I'll talk in a moment about some of those specifics, but that is a big thing that would make our proposal very different than what we've seen. So it's not that other states don't have weighted student formulas or some kind of local control and have accountability, but the way our proposal is drafted, it tries to tie both of those together. And so that is a real departure, or it would be a real, you could call it an innovation, than what others have done. So This isn't modeled after someone else. So we're making this up for California. And in part, I think, responding to some of the, the confluence of things where we're going to need to update our accountability system, and we want to be able to provide some local control, but there's some key things that we need to address. So how do we mush that all together?